Hello, everyone. Welcome to MEERTALK. My name is Kaeza Fern, and I am the Director of Communications at MEER. We're so glad to see everyone here for another MEERTALK. Today, we will be hearing from Dr. Ronita Bardhan. Then we'll have a question and discussion period, and we'll open it up to questions from all of you. Before we begin, I want to update you a little bit about MEER. We are putting things in place for an experiment in India, and you'll be hearing more about that in our upcoming newsletter and on social media. If you would like to contribute toward our efforts, we do appreciate every single donation. So you can go to meer.org/donate. And thank you very much for the contributions you make. So I'd love to tell you about our guest speakers. Dr. Ronita Bardhan is Associate Professor of Sustainable Built Environment and Public Health at the University of Cambridge. She's also Director of the Sustainable Design Group, and we are really lucky to have her here to speak with us today. If anybody has any questions come up while Dr. Bardhan is presenting, then you can send them to co-host Barbara in the chat. Okay, well, thanks so much for coming today.
Thank you, Kaisa. All right, thank you so much for taking out your time to listen to my work on heat and climate change and what it means to a large chunk of population across the world. So I have titled my talk as On the Heat of the Moment, and literally, probably also metaphorically, why and what it means to look at different culture, different contexts, and different agencies of different stakeholder groups. I am, as Kaisa said, I'm an associate professor of sustainable built environment. I'm also an associate faculty at the Cambridge Public Health, and I primarily work on the intersection of built environment, health, and energy burdens, especially in low-income communities. I lead the Sustainable Design Group, and if anybody is interested to know what this group works, there's this link QR code on the webpage. You could follow that. I primarily work on these 4 verticals of Sustainable Development Goals, which talk primarily about sustainability of communities, low-income communities, through which we can respond to the larger challenges of health and energy burdens. And definitely gender cannot be segregated from all these SDGs. So definitely a part of my work also responds to SDGs in terms of gender equality. So if I have to say what exactly I do, I try to develop designs of built environment, but just design is not just design of a physical environment, but systems design and process design also as a precision prevention for health and energy burdens that various communities might face across the world living in very resource constraints. And so if you look at the data or the type of data I work on, I will often go along with computational modeling and simulations, also experimental campaigns across the world, while installing sensors in different built environment to understand and develop a deep understanding of how built environments react with climate and create microclimates, which has direct correlation to health and well-being. I also collect a huge amount of data, which is called social practices, about like what does a typical day look like and what happens when a certain type of temperature rises, what do you do on a heat wave day, and these sort of questions I do ask. On this, I also try to imagine and I try to collect data on what is the perception of health risks people face while they face these sort of climate challenges. And I use this to inform the larger goals of sustainability, also in terms of both net carbon emissions as well as space efficiency, occupant well-being, energy efficiency. So there are 2 great challenges that we are facing currently in the world. Our world is heating up, and it's going to be more frequent that we are going to face quite hot summers or extreme summers, and Second thing that is happening is there's a huge boom of rapid urbanization in the global south. That means a large number of housing will come up in the coming decades, to the extent that majority of the housing stock probably doesn't exist. And in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll see a huge amount of stock that will come up in these sort of global south cities that are rapidly urbanizing. And so how do we tackle these two problems together? What are the available solutions, and what do we do to understand the specific context specific questions that needs to be responded in order to understand what are the heat challenges or health challenges? So this brings me to the greater challenge. What is this global south divide? The global south, there is this imaginary line that we all are quite aware of, that there's a larger population, primarily in the resource constrained setting in the global south, who will be our future urbanized. So if you look at how the population dynamics have been since in these ages, majority of the population in the global south is quite young. So they are going to face quite a large amount of climate change impacts, which will be quite drastic, even for the global north, because then there is a large proportion of population who will be at an elderly situation where they would need support to mitigate and adapt to the changing world. That means I borrowed this image from IPCC, which says that a person born in 2020 will see much more severe impacts of climate change, specifically heat or temperature rise, than a person who was born in 1980 or 1950, who are currently elderly or currently in their middle ages. So this definitely, so an adult elderly and a young adult would be are the people who will face different impacts of climate change, of these extreme events, whereas a young person who is still going to go through this extreme climate change will face much more severities in different aspects of their life. So there's this question of equity versus equality, that should we adapt anything that is happening across the world as an example to kind of mitigate or respond to climate change in other parts of the world, or is there equity question? Is there the question of distribution of resources, the question of amount of wealth available to mitigate these sort of challenges or even adapt to it? So adaptation seems much more important in this case, in terms of when extreme heat waves come into play, and heat has been something which we often have read about and is often termed as a silent killer, primarily because human body in different parts of the world, and especially in the global south, people have been living with heat. So an extreme heat day might not register as an extreme risk, perceptive risk. Some of the traditional solutions will no longer work, and that's quite evident. Putting on an air conditioning unit just to cool yourselves down, specifically in an extreme heat day, might not no longer work, primarily if the temperature, one is because there's a huge amount of energy burdens that these communities face. So even if they can afford an air conditioning unit, probably they will not be able to afford the energy prices and energy cost. And we have seen in the recent decades, and it's irrespective of being global south or north, we have seen a very drastic energy crisis last winter in the UK, and that's has led to large amount of energy poverty, where people have been living in colder homes. Vice versa, there are a similar situation can be seen in tropical climates, where people, even if they afford an air conditioning unit to cool themselves down, they cannot afford to run that air conditioning unit for significant amount of time, for which can mitigate their health impacts. So there's this context of urbanization tension, this large amount of built environment that will come up in the next decade. Nearly 300 million affordable housing will be needed by 2030 to accommodate the future urbanization. And so that has a link to the energy burdens and the health burdens. But the question is, can we use these feedback loops to design built environment in a way that they can mitigate or adapt to the changing environment? So today I'm going to show you examples from different parts of the world, primarily Africa and India, to explain the context of what heat means to different kind of people, and what sort of solutions are available or can be available for a group of people. So when we look at urban cities, primarily in these rapidly growing cities, we often find these are unplanned cities. These are cities that has never gone through a formal planning process. That means a large variety or diverse range of different types of built environment come up within a very short spatial span within cities. And we can see in the image on the left hand side that there is extreme high rise, and then there are extreme high density compact high rise buildings, and then there are high density compact low rise buildings. What this happens is built environment gets modifies the local microclimate just because of this sort of a peculiar configuration, and there is also a synergistic correlation between these coexisting in close proximity to each other. So that means that each form might have a peculiar thermal signature, and our endeavor would be to, in order to define better, more sustainable cities, to find out, is there a particular form or is there a particular built environment for an urban form that can cool itself down faster, because all the forms are going to heat up because they are made of materials that will absorb a lot of amount of heat and will create heat island effects. So we started looking at a typical city in India, where we saw what are the typical forms that are available. So you can see where in UFT 0, these are extreme high rises, but has certain amount of distance between the buildings. So the fourth column that you see with these tall black towers, these are representation of the building height and the distance between the building. Whereas UFT 1, you see quite high rise buildings, more than 24 meters, but they are quite apart from each other. A different configuration of that sort of building, where the buildings are extreme low rise, but the distance between them are very low. Whereas there is another configuration where it is mid rise and the distance between them is a bit higher than the UFT2, and then there's the UFT4. So we found that most of these built environment have a peculiar configuration, and it will be interesting to see if there is one form from this matrix that can cool themselves or automatically cool themselves down, so that people who live in these sort of areas do not need to switch on an artificial or energy intensive cooling device to cool themselves down on a typical summer day or a typical extreme heat wave day. So we installed a huge amount of sensors across the city to understand different sorts of environment, to understand how fast a particular form cools down. So you see in this case, I'll try to use my laser pointer so it's easier. In this sort of a case, which was extreme high rise, but there was distance between the building was quite high, we found that the temperature or during a midday, which is like around 2 o'clock, it quite reaches quite high, and this is annual average. So on a particular daily basis, it can go even higher. So it reaches quite high, around 42 degrees, but it cools down favorably faster, and then it remains cooler. So any gray part which is bottom below the red line is more comfortable. So people will tend to open their doors and windows and not switch on any sort of energy intensive active cooling devices to cool themselves down. So we did find, although it heats up quite fast, it cools down quite faster. Also, it stays cooler for a longer time, from 6 o'clock in the evening to 10 o'clock in the morning. And then again, the cooling heating process starts as the day progresses. So, however, there was another form which didn't heat up to a very large extent, but it took a long time to cool down, so much so that only the thermally comfortable hours were between 10 o'clock in the night to 8 o'clock in the morning. That does mean there will be a large significant evening available where people would demand active cooling, or people would demand energy intensive cooling devices, which means in a resource constraint setting, they will either be in a heat stress situation or in a setting where people have access to cooling energy devices. They will switch it on and add to the heating burden which already exists. So moving forward, we tried to understand, is there a particular form which has a higher relative risk from heat? And so we did find that there was one form which had extreme high relative risk from heat, and we wanted to see whether this form is one of a kind within a city, or is it like quite frequently available in a particular growing city? And is there a mitigation option that we can see? So we started looking, exploring more and more, and what we found out is that typically this form has a very unique building bylaws, and this form is a special, has special purpose bylaws in order to build it, because they have an aberration from the National Building Code, which says that distance between the buildings should follow this 45-degree line. That just means that there is ample distance between the building to allow for natural ventilation and daylight. For high-rise building, the angle can be a little bit more steeper, which is up to 63 degrees. However, for these high-rise affordable housing, the angle is extremely steeper, to the extent that only minimum distance between the building is prescribed, which is said 3 meters. So what happens when a recommendation guideline says minimum distance between should be minimum 3 meters, you often get distance between the building as the minimum threshold. You don't get it beyond that. So converting this into the current logic of policy space is that how does this form exist, and what is the history of this form existing in a particular setting, is that most of the global south cities, what they are going through is a transformation and a transition from what we call low rise, typically known as slum. I don't like to use that word for lack of a more clearer word. I'm using it as of now. What they are doing is they are replacing these slums with these high-rise units, which are very closely packed together. So these are hyper-dense situations where these sort of building codes play an important role. We went into these sort of communities and tried to see what is the health and the energy burdens in these sort of communities. And we did a lot of experimental campaign, and I'm going to show you how it works. So most of the cities, also if you look at the frequency of these sort of forms coming up rapidly, is they replace this sort of a low-rise, extreme dense situation, which often known as slums in the global south, are replaced by these high towers, and they are coming up or mushrooming up across the city in very large numbers, so much so that in Mumbai, typically 50 to 55% of population lives in slum or slum-like settlements. So they would be the first participants into this program, where they shift from the slums to these sort of high-rise towers. How does this look like in terms of design? So just as a mental map, just keep in mind there are 3 different forms that are available across the city to be built, which is the X type. The X type means you have the central core where the lifts and the staircase is, and you have 4 different wings where the apartment units are. Second type is the I type, which is the simple double-loaded corridor, which we see across the world in affordable housing, and they are as a very simple play out of a I type. There's another unique form which is called the H type, where the corridor runs at the periphery of the units. So that means the units do not have direct access to outside. Any access to outside is through the corridor that runs along the perimeter of the building. Just remember this X, I, and H type, and you'll see how it plays in terms of burdens. So we started looking at the heat burden of these sort of buildings when they are in comparison to their dwarf parts, which is the horizontal slums. And we wanted to see if these buildings are being built as a replacement of slums or low-income habitats. Do they perform better than what they were originally were? We did find that there are 2 different broad forms, which I have just now said. There are M2 and M3, where there is some sort of a community design or communal layout within the space in M2, whereas M3 is tower blocks, which we have seen across the world coming up in the 1960s and 70s during the post-industrialization phase. And we did find there is one form, which is the M2 form, that had higher number of compliant days. That means it was at least higher number of days where people might not switch in any sort of energy intensive cooling devices in order to mitigate their thermal stress. And we also could find out living in which floors become extremely challenging. So we said that if you are living on the top floor or near the top floor, those are much more desirable. However, if you are living on the bottom floors or typically up to the first and the second floor, and typically in the months of extreme heat, they become the most sufferers. So there is an inequity or asymmetry in the health burdens just within a particular building. So that plays up and scales up when the community design becomes much more, doesn't respond to these sort of heat burdens and create more channels of trapping of the heat. So what we did, we wanted to understand that what is the indoor heat burden or heat stress in different forms of building. So we did a thermographic study to understand what is the outside temperature on a hot summer day in March, where the outside temperature was average 30 degrees, but the wall temperature itself, but the external wall temperature itself was 38. So you can imagine, because of normal convective processes, indoor temperatures will be extremely higher unless there are options for mitigating it through ventilation, natural ventilation, or aided ventilation through a fan or an energy intensive cooling device like an air conditioning unit. If you look at from a very gendered perspective, we asked a group of cohort of people, a group of males and females, to respond to at what temperature they feel more thermally comfortable. And it's also a response to what sort of clothing they wear. And the values that you see at the bottom of each of the image is a kind of an insulation value. So it's no longer, it's not yet extreme winter here, so we are not wearing jackets. But if you turn around a jacket and see the label, there will be some sort of value that is written, which is said 90% down or 0.9% down, which kind of says how much insulation that you can get. Typically, a summer clothing should be within a range of 0 to 0.5, 0 being a naked body and 0.5 being a very thermal summer clothing, whereas a winter clothing is around 1 CLO. You can see, because of sociocultural practices and acceptability of different sorts of norms in different conditions, the male population has the power or empowered to adjust their clothing insulation as per their thermal comfort demand. Whereas if you see on a except for one very young lad who wanted to be very stylish and was wearing heavy jeans and a t-shirt because it was just for a style cushion, and the whole heat factor didn't matter to them. And this is another sort of a question which I don't want to take it up as of now, but definitely you can, the whole image of being Western, the whole image of being in a more modernized society can lead to these sort of unintended consequences of thermal discomfort that can have health impacts. Whereas if you look at the females, we found out that they were much more forgiving. So they adjusted their clothing. They couldn't adjust their social cultural norms do not allow them to adjust their clothing a lot. So they have to be covered up quite a lot. So if it was a traditional clothing with a traditional material, which is cotton, allows a lot of breathable space and they can use it. But due to modernization and industrialization, a lot of clothing which was traditionally made of cotton is now being made with polyesters and different sorts of material that are not that breathable as what cotton would be. So they raises the insulation value to an extremely high limit. And so you can see, on an average, a woman would be wearing a clothing that has insulation closer to a winter setting. And this is very concerning, because in a social cultural setting, when the adaptive saturation of one cohort of population is very high, that means they are more forgiving to extreme high temperatures. Because they have to conform to a certain social cultural practice, the health burdens that come with it become invisible to them. So the perceptive risk of heat is much lower, in a sense that they do not even take intervention when physiologically their body goes on a heat stress. And so if you summarize, we tried to see what happens in a future scenario in a different climate, when the climate is heating up at a 2-degree limit or a 1.5-degree limit. And we then simulated what happens in 2020 versus what will happen in 2050, both indoor outdoor temperatures, and what will happen in 2080. And we can see it's quite concerning, because these data are all annual averages. So we can see, on an average, the indoor temperature, which is these dark lines, around in 2080 will reach a temperature which is around 38 degrees. 38 degrees is a very unique temperature. So this is annual average. It will going to stay around that time during a hot summer month. That means it can go even higher than 40 degree, 42 degree. And this is what we have witnessed during the recent heat wave in these sort of context in the global south, where temperatures were constantly above 42 degrees. Outside temperature I'm talking about, which means the indoor temperatures were even higher because of the thermal mass. And if they were not being liberated, they would have to switch to air conditioning unit. There's another consequence of it. Beyond a 30 certain temperature, which is our body's core temperature, beyond that temperature, if our bodies are unable to thermoregulate, so that means they will not be able to sweat it out, which gives us a perception of cooling. So if a body cannot sweat it out beyond a certain temperature, that does mean the body will no longer be able to cope with that heat, and the heat stress will now become a health burden and will become a health risk. And this is very, very concerning, given a point of from the point of these gender differences and from a cultural context. When we ask these women and men about what temperature they would switch on an air conditioning unit, or even a fan for that extent in a very resource constrained setting, the men registered a much lower temperature, which is around 28 point some degrees, whereas the women had a higher threshold, which was around 29, 30 degrees. Although because of our sample size, it was not significant, a statistically significant difference, but we would wish to carry forward this sort of a work with a larger cohort of population representing different sorts of climates, to see if this adaptive saturation is really that high for women. But what it means to health is women will not take any sort of intervention of heat stress, although physiologically their body would be on stress, to mitigate the heat. And so we'll have a future cohort of population who will be extremely health burdened, and that would translate into different sorts of disability, disabled life that they are going to lead. And that's very concerning, because the productive young population of the global south will, and a cohort of them will suffer from this sort of health burden, much unknowingly, much because the traditional custom practices do not allow for some of these adjustments. So I'm going to play a small little clip, and just let me know if the clip sound is visible, or probably I need to then go and change the setting.
ना कि शाम 5 बजेगा ना, उसके बाद आप बाहर नहीं खड़े हो सकते, इतना मच्छर है। और गर्मी तो पूछो मत, घर में तो अंदर अभी भी अंदर जाएंगे तो घर में अभी भी लगेगी, इतना बारिश गिरे तो भी गर्मी है। उसके वजह से बीपी, एक तो मुझे भी बीपी है तो हाई हो जाती है कभी कभी।
So this is we did an extensive survey in Ethiopia and India, and I'll share the film later on, where we interviewed women from Africa in Ethiopia and in India, Mumbai in India, who have been shifted from these slums to these high-rise buildings, and it's a honeymoon phase, because they are now having a tenured apartment unit in the city of in one of the costliest cities of the global south. So it's a huge upliftment for them. They have a toilet inside the homes, so it's a wonderful aspect from their life being uplifted from where they were. But when we ask them what does it mean to them living in these sort of houses, has their health burden increased, has their medical bills increased, and has is there something that they really don't think that these houses are corresponding to, or letting so we had an immense amount of data from transcripts from these sort of communities. While we were taking this, we've also ran a lot of experimental campaign to know the exact value of their threshold of their temperature. And we did find these sort of common things coming up, that they are falling sick much more often, they have high electricity bills because the indoors are extremely dark, and you can guess this is probably the H type, because the light is almost compromised because of the corridor. Also because of privacy concerns, concerns of socio-cultural customs of women should not be visible from to strangers directly from outside. So all of them combine together to restrict the airflow within the house, which adds up to this health burden. Then as a visual representation, when we look at which are the units become extremely high stress and heat stress, this is a medical index to understand at what sort of danger these sort of units are. So the more red they are in danger. And we can see there are certain units which will be reporting as 24 hours in extreme danger situation, and that's a huge concern. And that kind of calls for redesigning or rethinking these sort of units in a much more climate context way. So we did this sort of a exercise where we looked into low income houses which have been built in Kenya. This is an example where we found out, because Kenyan government has invested a lot in mitigating the effects of mosquito burden, which is the malarial burden. So they have installed a large number of interventions into these houses to prevent mosquito entry. Typically, I was not very much aware of mosquitoes like where people cook. Typically, people used to cook outside because of the mosquitoes, repellent systems being installed in these sort of houses. They have shifted the whole practice of cooking indoors. What it means that when these sort of repellent technologies are kind of after 2 to 3 years, when they need a maintenance, people don't do it because now the government aid is gone and now the subsidy attached to it is gone, and now they have to maintain it. So it's costly for them, or probably it's more perceptively costly for them. So they don't do any sort of intervention. So now they are cooking indoors. Their indoor temperatures are extremely high. This is typically this is the cook stove, and this is where they live. And there's a bed at the corner. And also now the burden of indoor pollution raises, just because of the intervention was for to ward off mosquitoes. And now with climate change, on an extreme heat day, temperatures can rise as up to 46 degrees. And we did a huge amount of campaign to understand what sort of temperatures are there. So we have now images from large number of units where we saw temperatures of surfaces reaching as high as 72 degrees on a hot summer day. So that means the indoor temperature will be extremely higher. So we started looking at, is there a solution where we don't invest a lot, so low cost intervention that can reduce the pollution burden, with which it will also reduce the heat burden. So we said that if people just open the windows while they are cooking, you can reduce the pollution burden and heat burden. Typically, I'm showing here the pollution burden to a significant level from large percentage of which was around 1600 microgram per meter cube to around 1000, which is even higher because World Health Organization limits it to 50 microgram per meter cube in a cooking area. And it's on an annual average, it's around 800, because the ambient pollution is also very high. We said that also, apart from windows, if they combine it with partitioning the cooking zone, if they combine it with a HEPA filter, open the windows in areas that increases the air exchange rate, we can actually reduce it to nearly 94%. But if you don't do any of these, if you just install an extract fan, because windows has a different sort of a cultural meaning in different contexts, it's not just a thermal comfort control. So what if we just install an extract fan, that can reduce it to nearly 98% without much of investment. And most of these houses are being built by government. It's just one addition to these units that can reduce the burden to significant extent. We then started looking at people who have invested personally to install these extract fan. How does it look like in reality? Because there was no space available on the wall, they had to close majority part of the window in order to install that extract fan, and also for the extract fan to work. So if the windows are open and if the extract fan on the window is there, then it might happen, the pressure difference might not be created to drive away the pollution from inside to outside, and it might happen sometimes a reverse action might also take place. And that's concerning. So often the extract fan installed by the people might not actually serve the purpose for which they have been installed. So then we looked at a little bit higher. This was on respiratory disease. So we looked at tuberculosis burden, because this is a highly concerning issue in the global south. Respiratory diseases, typically tuberculosis burden is very high in these sort of communities. We wanted to see, is there a particular design that registers lesser amount of incidence of tuberculosis or prevalence of tuberculosis? So we found out where the X type reported had very high daylight. So anytime in the image you see orange or yellow, those are the areas in the apartment where daylight is received. Anything that you're seeing blue in the daylight column, it means the rooms are not received. That portion of the room is not receiving any daylight. And it's so evident in the H type, only the corridors receive the direct daylight, and any diffusion doesn't happen a lot within the windows, within the interior apartments. And we saw the similar thing with the film, where the woman was standing right outside their door, and on a broad 11 o'clock on the morning, in this sort of there was no daylight inside the room. It was quite dark. Also, air velocities were poor in H type, and we did find there was high prevalence of tuberculosis in these sort of houses, I and H type, where we found out these sort of incidences or prevalences are happening to people who have lived in these sort of houses for a significant amount of time, 4 to 6 years. Whereas people who reported tuberculosis in the X type had developed the tuberculosis within 6 months to 1 year after shifting, which might also say they might had the tuberculosis before they shifted to this area. So it was probably not a factor of the built environment as a contribution to the incidence. This is concerning, because this is kind of, we built the city, or we build their units in a way that increases the burden. This was a study done in 2018, and it was a big hunch at that point in time, where we thought that probably going down, there will be more female people who were reporting tuberculosis incidents than male. And typically, I was not much aware of the tuberculosis burdens, gender differences, but typically across the world, on average, tuberculosis is more of a male disease, because they pick it up from their workplace and being outside. And so we said, but probably living in these sort of areas, women will also have quite a high burden. And 2021 census, it was quite prevalent. There was an increase by 7%, where females were more than males reporting this disease. And this does mean that they will be living indoors with their children. So there will be large amount of children population who might also get contracted the disease. And this is happening primarily in the H types today. This brings me to what can be done. So what we did was, this was with my colleague, what we did was we wanted to make their daily life visible to them, so that it empowers them to take actions. So what we did was we had 5 women in India and 5 women in South Africa, and we asked them to record 15-second videos and upload it through WhatsApp into and these 15 seconds videos would capture 5 moments of their days for 5 days. And we wanted to see the disparities that bring in. So we did, and then made it into a small little video, and I play a small clip of it here. So what we saw was that majority of their time they were cooking. So they typically cook in India, they typically cook 3 times, on an average 3 to 4 times a day. And each cooking event would be around 1 to 1.5 hours. That means before the indoor pollution and the heat burden can actually get released, they start cooking. So it's a continuous vicious cycle of heat being constantly generated, added to the external burden of the heat that comes in. And this was when we made this visible, it empowered them with the data. First of all, we got comments like, oh, we didn't realize we work so much. So they typically spend 56 hours of their week on just maintenance activities and childcare activities, which is way above any sort of labor standards across the world. Also, they realized that opening windows and doing these sort of small little changes in their lives can actually release them from that burden. So I think although our intention was to capture their daily life and their interaction with energy appliances, over and above that, we could also generate a new data that made their burden more visible for them to take intervention. Lastly, I'll come to a very recent work that where we said that factor in gender to beat the heat in impoverished settlements, and that becomes extremely helpful because none of the data currently collected on heat actually factor in this gender difference. And it's important because different communities, different contexts have different gender norms, and if we capture that on a more structured basis, we will be able to make this heat burden much more visible and much more targeted in terms of policy intervention. So the data gaps are the culprit currently, and we can actually bridge it up. And that brings me to last penultimate slide, where we do these sort of very graphic feedback campaigns where we show these experimental results in a much more accessible way, where we say if you open the windows, switch on the fan, your smoke will be removed within say 15 minutes. But what you are currently doing, you have closed all the windows, and so it takes around 2.5 hours to release all the smoke. It also means that they will realize, because they don't understand air pollution, they don't understand heat, but they understand smoke from cooking. There are a large number of choices that can be uptaken by different communities, and we made a matrix of that in terms of green roofs, green walls, thermally efficient buildings, to see and worked with stakeholders, different stakeholders, to see if there is a potential of to find out the degree of effectiveness of all these solutions that are available, in order to, from not just the point of effectiveness, technical effectiveness of reducing the heat burden, but also acceptability in the society. So if we rank all of these technologies not by just their effectiveness of reducing the heat burden, but also from the aspect that they are more acceptable in the society, then probably that's the degree of effectiveness that we can bring in mitigating the heat burdens. And that brings me to the conclusion slide. So what can we do? So I say it's a three-step process, which is, first is we have to recognize the burden and calculate the burden embedded in a culture and a context. Grounding the burden with interlinked SDGs might also mean we are solving other sorts of SDG-related challenges that come with these heat burden. After that, reflect on the results or the burden that we get and make it a more people-centered approach in order to tackle and mitigate and adapt to the heat by making intangible information much more accessible and empowering, and creating agencies within communities so that they take intervention when it is required. Lastly, this also enables in informing policy through evidence, which is very, very important. So any policy decision driven through evidence will have much more higher success rate in terms of intervention. And in order to assure that this sort of work or the mitigation strategies or the policies that have been in place to mitigate the heat burden, you have to transfer agencies to the people where the burden lies, and generating these sort of new data around that and making it much more visible to the larger community can also spur a new generation of entrepreneurship around this. And of course, bottom line is built environment can be a climate action if done right. And if nothing else works, I always say we should pray. Thank you so much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Bardhan. You have gathered so much evidence, so much data, and I do hope that is successful in transforming the way things are. There's a lot that we'll be wanting to revisit. I think you've gathered so much in a way that is, really coherent. We can take it in. So thank you for that. We'd love to bring on someone from our MEER community who will ask a question or two. Jonathan Cole is a reflective energy engineer in California who's been prototyping residential and rooftop reflective foil systems since 2014 to optimize durability and neighborhood acceptance. Thanks for coming on, Jonathan.
Hey, thank you. Wow, that was a lot of information. Thank you so much for gathering that all and presenting it so clearly. This is really important information, and I can make a lot of use of it. I have questions on two slides.
Yes.
on slide 27, you talked about tuberculosis. Did you also gather data about something like death from all causes to see whether the migration from the slum, so to speak, to the new buildings caused a general increase in health or a reduction in general health?
We didn't have the mortality data. So in these sort of contexts, mortality data is extremely difficult to acquire. So, but what we did have was we asked them how often you fall sick. So that's a good indicator of their health burdens and what sort of complaints, why they go to visit a doctor. So their healthcare seeking behavior. So we captured that, and we did find people living in the bottom floors, typically ground floor to first floor, maximum second floor, they had much more revisits to their doctors, keeping in mind that these sort of communities do not see a doctor until they feel they're going to die. So do nothing scenario is so prevalent in these sort of communities that they are actually going and taking a healthcare seeking behavior means it's quite drastic. So it was interesting. So we don't have the all causes death for this sort of community by community. And it's also a data I don't think we will have access to because I don't think it's collected in that sense. We had access to, though, the tuberculosis data, that is the prevalence of tuberculosis. And this is interesting because people do not report tuberculosis for various reasons, various cultural practice, various sort of stigma that is associated to it. But there is a system in place in many of these communities, typically in the global south, where health workers go in and visit all these houses to see if there is a marker of tuberculosis. So even if people don't come and actively report tuberculosis, we will still have a data on whether there is a prevalence of tuberculosis in these sort of communities. And so we had that data access. And so we just said, let's see if there is any sort of correlation to where they are living. Although we have to keep in mind tuberculosis, there is no causality that we can prove through this. We can only see association and correlation because tuberculosis is a very complicated disease. It is related to nutrition, the type of work a person do, type of environment a person is constantly exposed to. So there are a lot of confounding factors there. But I strongly believe, and through this evidence, we strongly believe how we have been designing our future affordable housing needs to be questioned from the angle of health. And it's important that we start collecting evidence sooner, so we do have an opportunity to correct them as more and more of these units will come up in the next decade.
Great, thank you. And then the other slide is slide 32. If it's possible for you to reshare that slide.
Yeah, absolutely, I'll try.
Acceptance of technology. I work a lot in that area trying to get people in the neighborhoods to not complain about the installation of different mechanisms. And so the acceptance of technology is huge in terms of whether anything will get done.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm trying to interpret this chart. Is the reddish color a better acceptance or a lesser acceptance?
So those were the hours of heat stress in the community. So when you prepare this sort of a chart and show it to people and say that this technology doesn't work and will give you so many hours of discomfort versus this technology will give you so many hours of discomfort, it makes the communication much more visible, and people don't understand numbers. And it's important that we create these sort of accessible medias to generate the acceptability. Also, even speaking to people and giving them this power to decide becomes much more empowering down the line, because then they do have the data to challenge and go back to their community leaders or their respective policymakers and say that we were promised this, but we were not promised that it'll come with this sort of health burden. Can you help us mitigate that? So they have this. It becomes very, very powerful when we put the data into these sort of very accessible forms. And that's what I wanted to emphasize, that when we were also looking at these sort of green walls, green roofs, and these sort of plethora of technologies for cooling cities, it's not just about whether they are implementable in a city. That's one thing, is a physical factor that comes in, but also, are they even acceptable? Like green roofs, fantastic, but they are not acceptable because people don't want to participate in the whole process of managing it while they're living in these sort of houses. There's lots of, in a tropical country, it can breed a lot of insects, it can cause a lot more in terms of managing the green roof to the level that it can mitigate. So these are a lot of challenges. So as advocacy, we can say, oh, let's do all the city as green roof, and then you come back and people say, oh, I use the roof as my economic generation, I'm not going to give it to you. And how much energy bills are you going to get me down? Say just few pounds or few dollars, and I can earn that within just three times I lend my roof for a party. And this is very real, and this is very physical, in the sense that if policymakers do not take into account the acceptability, we often have wonderful technological solutions and they don't get implemented because the community doesn't allow for that sort of activity. Whereas if you just go and ask them, we did a film on where we asked them, if you were to redesign your community, what sort of technologies would you available? And there is plethora of local cultural traditional technologies available embedded within these societies, and we do not have enough data for that. Why don't we first go and collect the data, understand what their lived experiences have been? There's a thermal mitigating heat is a very challenging task because there is a different thermal history for different communities, and people have lived with heat for longer time. So it doesn't feel a burden if there is a slight elevation to it. Even if it occurs multiple times, it doesn't feel like a burden. And people says, typically women will say, oh, it's fine, it's just few days in a summer and it's supposed to be like this. They don't realize that physically their bodies are going into these sort of extreme heat stress regularly as the frequency of heat wave days increases. And that's a very critical point in terms of responding to health. So that's why I say it's precision prevention when we want to respond to health from the technology side.
Right. I've noticed that too, that you can install a beautiful technology, but every technology needs a little bit of maintenance. And if the people ignore it and allow it to fall into disrepair, it becomes useless.
Absolutely.
And in the worst case scenario, they might repurpose it. They might decide, I'm going to take the materials from this new technology and repurpose it for something else that's more interesting to me. It's quite fascinating to figure out what people will accept and what they will maintain when it improves their temperature scenario.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. And then on another slide, you had the word compliant. Compliant day.
Yeah.
And some things had more compliant days and others had less compliant days. I wasn't able to determine in the speed that the slide went by whether a compliant day was a good thing or a compliant day was not a good thing.
So by compliant day, we defined it like if it is maintaining a temperature around 30 degrees indoors, so it is complying to the days. It is not exactly, because thermal comfort is so different across the world. So if you ask somebody sitting in the UK what is the thermal comfortable temperature, our air conditioning companies have made us believe that we are all comfortable at 26.6 degrees. Whereas when we did extensive surveys in the global south, we did find 28 to 30 degrees is still like they are comfortable with it. And that's because of the thermal history, that's because of how they have been living. So the more number of compliant days just means that people will not feel thermally uncomfortable, or there won't be thermal discomfort to the level that they are going to switch into some sort of device that is energy intensive. And that's where the compliant is. But these are all simulation works and needs to be extremely validated. So that's why we did the further work to understand what is that temperature at which people switch on an active energy, and people would prefer an active energy, but due to different reasons of agency, different reasons of social cultural practices, do not have access to it. So we have also found women who literally are sitting in a room where there is a ceiling fan, there is an air conditioning unit, but say that they don't want to switch it on when they are alone in the room. because they spend majority of the time indoors, the burden of high electricity bill will fall on them. So they only switch it on when there is men in the room or when there are children in the room. And that's a unique situation. And this is not a unique situation of one part of the global south. It's probably different forms or diverse forms of it can be seen in across the global south cities that are coming up. So it's this sort of data is not there in any sort of domain. We don't collect it in any sort of surveys. We don't even understand what does heat mean to people in different communities. And that's why heat becomes an extremely challenging task, because you have to understand the context much more in order to have targeted solutions for them.
Thank you so much. Those are great answers. And I look forward to your next presentation and new data set.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, that leads me, it is also intricate in terms of what you need to take into consideration. And it's fascinating that the women, found out, oh, look how much we're cooking. I mean, just even that fact by being presented with it. Is your sense, that urban planners have their eyes on any of this gender, any of the gender stuff? Do they even, is it on their radar screen?
I don't think so, because we don't capture that sort of data. So urban planners work with average population data. So every 5,000 households, they have to provide a PHC, which is a primary healthcare facility, and they work with that. They don't see if that sort of spatiality of the genderedness of that data. So if it is more females, more elderly females, so the burden on that PHC would be extremely high, or that sort of data. That's why I say factor in gender in all your data in a way that it makes the burden much more visible. So we collect the data, but we often collect it as a demographic and often forget about it when we are making decision-making processes. So
Yeah.
we still make decisions on household income, which is great, because that's one of the biggest factor in deciding in any sort of transition. But also there are agencies within communities that can be implemented by just looking at the diversity of the data in terms of whom are we catering to. Is this community, it is also, I'm not just talking about gender, it's also about, there's another layer of religion, there is another layer of where people come from. These are so embedded in culture, and we don't even talk about it when we are thinking about technological solutions. And that's so important when we have to quickly mitigate and reach the net zero targets as promised by majority part of the world.
If anybody has questions, you can go ahead and send them in the chat along to Barbara. And while we see if some questions pop up, I guess I just wanted to ask you a question about your own background a little bit, and what got you interested in, this type of work and this type of study.
Yeah, it's actually, it wasn't planned, but I always felt that city planning or urban design or even built environment design is much more powerful beyond creating extraordinary buildings. As architects or engineers, we are always kind of motivated to create iconic buildings, tallest tower in the world and all of that. And that's great, because that pushes the boundaries of civilization, that pushes the boundaries of human capabilities, and that's fantastic. But what I felt over and over again was there is a lot power in ordinariness of built environment, and we often don't look at the ordinariness in the lens that we should be. Because where I was born in India, I grew up in India. I have seen practices that around sun. And that's primarily because houses were built in a way so that to let in the morning sun, to let in the afternoon sun, and you have practices around it. So my mother used to always say, as soon as you get up from the bed, put your blankets and pillows on the sun, and then go to further to carry on with the rest of the day. And that there is a reason behind it, because there is lot amount of disease that can be prevented just by exposing your house to the UV rays that is required. And we never realized that unless, so that's why I'm saying these sort of practices were there, and that's why the house design, the residential designs were in response to that. Today we are in the ode of looking as a global city or a world city. We have forgotten that, and today all our cities look similar. So any city that is doing economically well will try endeavor to look like and today if you go to the central business district of Mumbai or Nairobi, you will have buildings which you will probably find in Singapore or Hong Kong or in New York or London. And that's saddening, because what it does is it modifies the whole narrative was set that you can air condition your space. And that's where we have lost the sight that there is an ordinariness of these built environment that has causal links to health and energy burdens, and we often do not look into it. So when this was always while I was getting my training, I always felt this has much more power than we are actually using it. And when I, for a very brief period of time, I was in Mumbai, I was an assistant professor in IIT Bombay. And I used to go around the city and I saw these tall towers. They were all named as slum rehabilitation housing. And I was like, what are these housing? I've never seen this coming up in any part of the city, any part in other cities in India. What are these sort of houses? So I just started looking into it. I just went there with a bunch of sensors, talking to women there at 11 o'clock when there's no men in the house. And I said, I just want to install a few sensors. Would you allow me? Yes, some people trusted me and said, yeah, sure, go ahead. We got that data. That was so powerful. That was the first time we made it visible what it is to live in these sort of house in terms of indoor environment. And it's not post occupancy evaluation, it's about deriving design solutions from the lived experiences of them. So it's not about well the way the houses were designed or intended to be designed, are they performing that well. So it's different than post occupancy evaluation. And so that brought me in. And I increasingly saw people saying, oh, our electricity bills have gone up, our medical bills have gone up after we shifted to these houses. And that led me, it became so commonsensical to me. I said, why isn't this becoming so visible in mainstream policy, in mainstream, even media, to talk about that? This is so evident that there is huge amount of burden which is being designed in a sense. So that got me into this. And then I saw, surprisingly, Africa has a very similar building bylaws for these sort of houses. Surprisingly, across the global south, this is like a cookie cutter panacea sort of a design that helps liberate cities from slums. So it's a very good policy to create slum-free cities, but comes with consequences which needs some. So I would say it's a more of a myopic policy. I wouldn't say it's a wrong policy, because it does liberate a people from living in slums where women cannot attend toilets at night because it's quite dark and unsafe. Now they have toilets inside. So it's a wonderful policy, just needs to be more holistic in their approach.
Right. Let's see. Are there any? It looks like we're not having questions, but I'll ask one more question and just say, and some of our audience may know, as I mentioned before, we have a project that we're starting in Pune, in India. And I guess, I would just wonder, with you knowing that, do you have any words of wisdom to offer to us as we, begin to embark upon that?
So I'm not aware of the project in details, but I see some snippets on your webpage. I think where so if you could just talk me through in few sentences what exactly.
Yeah, we'll be installing some solar reflectors to bring down the temperature and do and install sensors and so forth, to do an experiment and bring down the temperatures in the houses in an area in Pune.
Yeah, I think that would be great to see the results. And one thing I would be looking forward is, what was when you made the data visible to people, or when you went to install the sensors, what are the questions that were asked? Or I think we cannot kind of not respond to the question of ethics while we are doing these sort of work. So it's very, very important you get the community people involved in your work. It generates a huge amount of acceptance. I have always done this, and most of my work, I will have somebody, a young lad who's a graduate in that community, who would get involved in the project, would then carry it forward in
Right.
different aspects. So they can, so a person who is capable enough to digest all the results and put it forward to their community leaders or policymakers, so that the power, the data that we as academics get, they in turn empower the society or the community in a sense that they can now have a power of negotiation.
Right. Yeah. Well, it looks like all of a sudden we do have a few questions that have come. If you have a few more minutes, I know it's evening where you are. Do you think you could stay on for another 5 minutes?
Another 5 minutes is fine. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So Rebecca is wondering if you have any favorite urban environment examples that come close to, addressing these problems.
I don't know, Indian villages or
Okay.
Nairobi villages. I have visited these Nairobi villages. They have a unique sense of creating communities in a sense that these communities are more humanized, and the built environment interacts with the community culture. It's no longer protective shell that creates a shelter, but it's also a part and parcel of their lives. So trying to that is in any communities that provide us this sort of opportunity to look into their lives more, and the housing is more of a verb than a noun, is something I feel any cities that have. So yeah, as of now, also I would say Singapore is doing fantastically well in terms of responding to their built environment to mitigate heat burdens, and that's something we should look forward to as cities urbanize. But I know Singapore is a very unique case. They have unique challenges also, but they have the resource to tackle it. So looking at communities that do not have the resource to tackle it, how do you do it? Go into the community. Every community has it. And not only that, in US I have visited affordable housing in California, and they have the solutions themselves. It's important that we bring them in the whole context of solution matrix, and not feel this top down recommendatory prescriptive solutions. I don't think it works.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question from Martin. Is there any data for these study regions on access to blue-green spaces?
I'm not aware in terms of data availability, in terms of access, but I'm pretty sure there are data on how much of greenness these sort of communities have, or even these sort of regions have. So that sort of data is available with different in terms of in form of satellite data and all of that. So that can be easily processed to find out the total amount of green
Yeah.
aspect of the city.
And what happens to the community and social interactions when people move from these low-rise sort of shantytown places to the high-rise buildings?
The social networks, the first thing that happens is a social network breaks,
Yeah.
which is immensely important for these communities to thrive both economically and socially. So they participate in informal economies. Informal economies work because of the strong social network, and when the social network breaks, it also affects their livelihood. So the first thing that happens is their social network breaks. There are also evidences that children are not sent outside to play because it's quite unsafe to send children downstairs, which was promised to be a green park area, is now a illegal parking zone. So parents do not send their children out to play. So there is evidence of stunted growth, and there is evidence of students children not growing to the capability that is required to. So these sort of evidence are also there. There's also, I don't know whether there is evidence in terms of mental health, but in my interaction with these communities over and over again, I have seen that there are huge markers of mental health issues that can crop up, which is currently completely invisible in data sets, completely invisible in terms of recognition of it or even considering it. So yes, this is important and probably a huge amount of resources required, and a concentrated effort is required to capture these sort of invisible data sets.
Mm. Well, we want to thank you so very much for talking to us today. This has been incredibly informative and thought-provoking. So thank you, and we're wishing you well.
Thank you so much. And happy to chat more on the Pune project, because I'm very eager to understand how these communities work. And it kind of is my passion also. So happy to talk more.
Wonderful. Okay, we'll be in touch. Thank you.
So much.
At MEER, we're working to help educate the public while also developing a solution to the warming on the planet. We invite you to keep learning about Earth's energy imbalance and climate science on our website, which, by the way, is new in case you haven't seen. Do take a look at meer.org. We're an almost 100% volunteer staff, so please do consider making a monthly donation of any amount. If you have enjoyed being here or watching any of our MEER talks, you can check out our YouTube channel for more of those, and of course follow us on social media. Our next MEER talk is Sunday, November 5th, and Professor Nuna Klutsa, Associate Professor from the University of Ghana, will be speaking about climate change in a talk entitled Climate Change from Science to Development and Moral Challenge. So we hope to see you on November 5th, and between now and then, take care. Thank you for coming.